It began not with a crown or a king, but with a company. By the summer of 1857, the British East India Company, once the most powerful corporation on earth, was on fire, literally. From Delhi to Cawnpur, the empire it had built through trade, treachery, and tyranny was crumbling beneath its own boots. The sepoys, Indian soldiers who had once marched beneath the company's flag, now turned their rifles on it. Smoke coiled over the plains, carrying with it the echoes of rebellion. Cities that had bowed to British merchants now bled in defiance. And at the center of the chaos stood a truth the world had never seen before, that a corporation, built for profit, could wield the power of a nation and lose it just as fast. For more than 2 centuries, the East India Company had been the sharp edge of Britain's ambition, conquering not through kings, but through contracts. It minted its own currency, commanded an army larger than Britain's, and governed more people than any monarchy on earth. It was capitalism before conscience, and in its hunger for profit, it consumed everything in its path: kingdoms, cultures, and millions of lives. But power, like spice, has a way of losing its flavor, and by 1857, that power was rotting from within. The rebellion would not just end a regime, it would expose the dangerous truth that an empire, when privatized, becomes something far more terrifying. Not a nation, not a king, but a machine, built to feed itself. And in the smoke of its collapse, the world would learn that even the mightiest empires can fall, when their only god is gold. At the dawn of the 17th century, the seas belonged to empires, and empires belonged to merchants. Spain plundered silver from the New World, Portugal claimed the Spice Islands, and England, late to the feast, sought a way to buy its way into the game. So on the last day of the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter, granting a group of London businessmen exclusive rights to trade in the East Indies. They called it the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. History would remember it by a simpler name, the East India Company. It began as a venture of ambition, ships packed with silver, dreams, and letters of credit. Its men weren't soldiers or statesmen. They were accountants with cannons, and in the holds of their ships, profit smelled like pepper, silk, and tea. But trade has a way of shifting into conquest. The company's merchants learned that influence was cheaper than invasion, that a few bribes could open more doors than 1,000 guns. Sultans and princes became partners, ports became colonies, and the company learned to rule not just markets, but men. By the early 1700s, the East India Company had built an invisible empire, stretching from London counting houses to the palaces of Bengal. It minted its own coins, flew its own flag, and negotiated treaties as if it were a nation itself. And in a sense, it was. For Britain, the company was a golden goose, filling the treasury, feeding the navy, and weaving the East into the fabric of empire. But beneath the veneer of trade lay something darker, a machine learning how to govern, exploit, and extract, without ever calling it conquest. It was no longer a company. It was a prototype, the first corporate superpower, and soon its hunger would outgrow the ledger. It would need something new to sustain its empire of trade, an army. The East India Company was born with a quill, but it conquered with a sword. By the mid-17th century, the line between merchant and monarch had vanished. The company no longer waited for permission to trade. It demanded it. And when persuasion failed, muskets did the talking. It began in Bengal, 1757, the Battle of Plassey, a humid June morning where merchants became warlords. Led by Robert Clive, a former clerk turned soldier of fortune, company forces faced the Nawab of Bengal, ruler of one of the richest provinces on earth. Outnumbered nearly 10 to 1, the company still won, not by courage, but by corruption. The Nawab's generals had already been bought. When the cannons fell silent, Bengal, the crown jewel of the subcontinent, belonged not to Britain, but to the East India Company. That victory changed everything. The company discovered a new kind of profit, one measured in land, taxes, and lives. And to secure it, they built a private army unlike anything the world had seen. Over 260,000 men, larger than the standing army of Britain itself. Paid in company coin, trained to enforce company law, fighting not for a flag, but for a balance sheet. Clive returned to London a hero, dripping in diamonds and scandal. Parliament hailed him as a conqueror, then investigated him as a thief. But by then it was too late. The company had become a state within a state, an empire with shareholders. Its soldiers marched beneath a corporate banner, its governors signed treaties in the name of commerce, and its ambition stretched further than any king's decree. The world had never seen power like this, an army without a nation, and a nation that didn't need a crown. But power bought with greed comes at a cost, and soon the same fields that fed the company's fortune would starve under its rule. Bengal was once called the paradise of nations, a land of poets, palaces, and fields that shimmered gold beneath the sun. But under the East India Company, paradise became a ledger entry. After the victory at Plassey, the company didn't just trade with Bengal, it owned it. Taxes, crops, even justice itself flowed upward, not to a king, but to the boardrooms of London. The new rulers were accountants in wigs, men who measured human lives in columns of profit and loss. And in 1770, their math turned monstrous. A drought struck Bengal, but the company, desperate to maintain its dividends, refused to lower taxes or release grain reserves. While their warehouses stayed full, the villages around them starved. Corpses lined the roads. The Ganges ran thick with the dead. 10 million lives gone in what became known as the Bengal famine. And yet, in that same year, company profits soared. London celebrated record earnings. Stockholders toasted the windfall, sipping tea sweetened by the suffering of a nation. Even Parliament, usually content to look away, began to feel the stench. A young Edmund Burke rose in the House of Commons to condemn the despotism of merchants. He warned that the company had become a state in the disguise of a merchant, a beast too dangerous to ignore. But the machine rolled on, because it worked. The company's coffers fueled Britain's rise, and Britain, in turn, shielded the company's sins. This was capitalism before conscience, an empire run on credit and cruelty. And while the profits glittered in London, the empire's foundation, India itself, began to crumble beneath the weight of its own exploitation. The East India Company had conquered a subcontinent, but it was losing something greater, its soul. By the late 1700s, the East India Company was no longer a merchant enterprise. It was an empire, rich, ruthless, and rotting. And in London, the stench of scandal had finally reached the throne. Rumors spread through Parliament like wildfire. Company officials living as kings, governors hoarding fortunes, armies crushing revolts in the name of trade. Britain had created a monster, and now struggled to keep its leash. Robert Clive, the man who once conquered Bengal, stood trial before Parliament for corruption and cruelty. He defended himself by saying, "Consider the situation in which I stood. A great prince was dependent on my pleasure." He was acquitted, but the words haunted Britain, because everyone knew he was right. No king on earth held as much unchecked power as the East India Company did in India. So the Crown began to intervene, carefully. In 1773, the Regulating Act gave Parliament the right to oversee company affairs. Then came Pitt's India Act in 1784, establishing a board of control to keep the company in check. But oversight meant little when profit ruled all. The company simply learned to appear respectable, masking its greed behind the language of governance and reform. In Calcutta, a new order took shape. Courts, councils, and clerks, all under the company's banner, imitating the structure of a government while serving the logic of a corporation. It was a strange partnership. The crown provided legitimacy, and the company provided wealth. Together, they reshaped India into a laboratory of empire, where British ambition and Indian resistance would forever collide. And yet, beneath the calm veneer of administration, the ground was beginning to tremble. The soldiers who filled the company's ranks, Indian sepoys, were growing restless. They prayed to gods their officers did not understand. They bled for a flag that was not their own. The British East India Company had mastered the art of control, but it had never learned the cost of betrayal, and soon that lesson would come in fire. By 1857, the East India Company's empire seemed unshakable. Its army stretched across the subcontinent, its flag flew over cities once ruled by princes, and its officials believed the land was theirs by right, a divine marriage of commerce and conquest. But beneath that illusion of order, something was smoldering. The company's Indian soldiers, the sepoys, were the backbone of its power. They marched under British command, but they carried their own faith, their own fears, their own pride. And after decades of arrogance, corruption, and cultural blindness, the company had turned its most loyal men into its greatest threat. The spark came in the form of a rifle, the new Enfield musket. Its cartridges were rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, an unthinkable insult to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. To use it meant to defile their faith. To refuse meant mutiny. In Meerut, the anger finally ignited. Sepoys rose against their officers, freed their imprisoned comrades, and marched toward Delhi, calling for the return of the old Mughal emperor. Their rebellion spread like wildfire, from Lucknow to Kanpur, from barracks to bazaars. For the first time, the East India Company faced not a rival kingdom or a foreign threat, but a people united against it. What followed was chaos and carnage. Villages burned, British officers and civilians were slaughtered, and in retaliation, company troops answered with equal brutality. It was not a war of independence, not yet, but it was a reckoning, the sound of centuries of exploitation coming home to roost. By the year's end, the rebellion was crushed. The company survived, but only just. In London, even the most loyal defenders of empire could no longer pretend. The experiment had failed. A corporation had tried to rule a civilization, and nearly destroyed both. The crown would soon take control, and the company, once the mightiest power in the world, would be quietly erased from history's books. When the smoke of rebellion finally cleared, the East India Company was finished, not by an enemy's sword, but by its own corruption. The uprising of 1857 had shaken Britain to its core. Reports of massacres and mutilations filled the papers, and public opinion demanded justice. But the truth was darker than vengeance. It wasn't rebellion that doomed the company. It was the revelation of how it had ruled. 2 centuries of exploitation stood exposed. The rigged trade, the forced famines, the puppet princes, and the endless cycle of profit disguised as governance. Even Parliament, which had long feasted on its riches, could no longer defend the beast it had bred. So in 1858, the British government stepped in. Queen Victoria signed the Government of India Act, dissolving the company's rule once and for all. India, vast, wounded, and weary, would now be governed directly by the crown. The age of the British Raj had begun. For the company, there was no trial, no reckoning, only silence. Its armies were absorbed, its assets seized, its name buried beneath polite bureaucracy. In 1874, a single line in the London Gazette announced its formal end. The company is dissolved. No parades, no tombstones, just a quiet death for the empire that had once conquered half a world. Yet its ghost lingered. The systems it built, of control, extraction, and corporate power, did not vanish. They simply changed uniforms. The East India Company had fallen, but the idea it created, that a private enterprise could shape nations, was just beginning to take root. It was, in the truest sense, the end of an empire, and the birth of something far more enduring. When the East India Company finally vanished, the world exhaled, but the shadow it left behind never truly disappeared. Its story was not just the tale of empire and greed, it was the blueprint for the modern world. Long before oil giants and tech titans, before stock exchanges ruled economies and corporations shaped policy, there was the East India Company, a private enterprise that learned how to wield the power of a state. It pioneered the tools we still recognize today: shareholders and monopolies, lobbying and propaganda, and the quiet fusion of profit with politics. It turned governance into business, and business into governance. Even its fall became a lesson, because when Britain took control of India in 1858, it didn't end the company's legacy, it institutionalized it. The Raj became the company in another form, a government wearing the mask of empire instead of enterprise. And as centuries passed, its ghost found new names, new nations, new markets. The idea that commerce could justify conquest, that profit could be a kind of destiny, never really died. The East India Company is gone, but its DNA runs through every corporation that spans oceans and bends governments to its will. It was capitalism before conscience, and perhaps still capitalism as we know it. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried in ledgers or ruins. It lingers in the contracts we sign, the markets we obey, and the quiet truth that the most powerful empires no longer fly a flag. And like so many stories we uncover here on the Dusty Ledger, it reminds us, the past is never truly past. It hides in the fine print, waiting to be read.